Okay, so at this point, users are able to share their notes with other users, and those users can actually go into the note and take a look at the content it contains without seeing the buttons that would allow them to share and edit that note. And we have protection on our back end so that even if the user figures out that they can just go to /notes/ID and see these buttons, they can't actually make changes, right? We saw that earlier. So what we're going to take a look at next is we're going to see how to actually add the concept of permissions to these notes so that instead of just sharing read-only access with other users, an owner can actually allow other users to edit their notes as well if they want to. Okay, so this is going to be an interesting process, but the first thing we're going to do here is remove this delete button from the shared with me because we don't want users to be able to delete these things when they don't own them. And in fact, right now we haven't even specified an onRequest delete function for our notes list component, so that wouldn't happen anyway. But regardless, let's go back here, and what we're going to do for our notes list here, we're going to say notes list, and basically what we're going to do is if this onRequest delete function is specified, then and only then will we actually display that button. Okay, so all we need to do for this is we just need to say onRequest delete and X button, right? Otherwise, that thing is just going to be hidden. So if we go back here, we should see that that X button is now hidden on the shared with me notes so that the user just can't delete them, right? So the next thing that we're going to do here is we're going to make it so that a user can actually give different levels of access to other users to their notes, right? We're going to have like read-only access, and for now we'll just have edit access as well. Obviously, there are other levels of permissions that we might want to assign as well, but for now we're just going to have two. So here's going to be our basic strategy for doing this, okay? Remember that currently what we're doing is inside our database, which we can open up here. There we go, I already have it up, in fact. Inside our database for each of our notes, if we say db.notes.findAll.pretty, remember that each of our notes that's actually been shared with someone has this shared with property, which is a list of the email addresses that that note has been shared with. Now, I talked previously in quite a bit of depth about the different options that were available to us with, sharing notes with other users and how we might format that in the database. And in order to implement this level of permissions, what we're going to do here is we're going to make some changes to how our data is structured. Now, first of all, let's just talk about the fact that there are still a few options available to us, as is often the case. One way of implementing this permissions thing that I just talked about would be, instead of having a shared with property here, we could have two separate properties, one being can edit and one being can view. And each of these properties would just be arrays of either emails or user IDs of the users who were able to edit that note and users who were able to view that note. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing it this way, but since we can foresee possibly adding more and more permissions in the future, it's going to actually be easier for us to structure this in a way that looks like this. Instead of having each of these just be an email address, we're going to have it be an object with the properties email, okay, and that'll be the email of the user. And additionally, we're going to have a property called role. Okay, this is something that's sort of stolen from Amazon Web Services and other places where you have lots of user management. Role, and this is basically going to be either edit or view for the time being. And this will actually allow us to add in different roles as time goes on, right? So if we want to allow the user to share with other users, we'll have role share, right? So there's going to be a few different levels. The first one is going to be view, where the user can just look at the note, they can't edit it. The next level up is going to be edit, okay, where the user can actually edit the note, and eventually we'll add another level here, which will be share, and that'll mean that the user can share that note with other users. Cool, so that's our basic plan here. We're going to convert our database to store its sharing data in this way instead of just as email addresses. And additionally, we might want to, just while we're at it, add the ID of the user into this object just to make things easier in the future if we ever need to use that user's ID. So to get started here, now that we know our basic strategy, what I'm going to recommend we do first is unshare this note with jane@gmail.com from, I believe this is john@gmail.com's ID, because that'll make it so that we don't have to go into our database and manually change this. So what we're going to do is go back to our application here, we're going to log out, and we're going to log in as john@gmail.com. Okay, and we're just going to change the share settings on our notes so that it's not shared with anybody. All right, so if we go back here, we're going to delete jane@gmail.com, and let's do the same thing here. Same thing. Okay, it looks like that was the only note that was shared. I thought there was another one here. We might have to actually go in and do it manually just for ease of use. Yeah, here we go. So it looks like shared with here. What I'm going to do here is just copy this note's ID, and I'm going to say db.notes.update1. We're going to update the note whose ID matches that thing that I just copied. And what we're going to do is we're going to say $set, and we're going to set the shared with property to just an empty array. Okay. Oops, and let's close that. Let's close those parentheses there. And sure enough, if we say db.notes.find again, we should see that the shared with property, if it exists on a note, is just an empty array. There's a lot of notes that it just doesn't exist on for now, which is perfectly fine. So the next thing that we're going to do now is we're going to rewrite some of our server endpoints to change that that structure of our data behind the scenes. So first of all, we're going to want to open our share note route. And what we're going to do, we're getting this email for a given user from the request body, right? When a user wants to share a note with another user, they send a request to /notes/noteid/shared emails with the email address that they want to share it with. And we're already checking to make sure that the user owns the note, and we're already verifying their auth tokens, so we don't have to worry about those things. What we are going to have to do, though, is instead of just saying shared with email and add to set, we're going to actually change this to push, and instead of just pushing their email onto the shared with array, we're going to say email, and it's going to be an object, and we're also going to add the role thing that I talked about, and this is going to be, well, for now, we'll just say view. Now, what we're going to need to do is, well, two things really. We're going to need to add something to the request body when the front end makes a request to the share note route to specify what the role of the user that we're sharing with should be, right? So that this won't have to be hard-coded like it is. Okay, and we're also going to need to add another endpoint here for editing this permission, right? If the user doesn't want to unshare a note with another user, but they do want to change their permissions. So we're going to have to create another route for that a little later on. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So for now, we're just going to add role view, and we're going to have email. And we're going to also want to add the user's ID, which we can get from user with email here. So let's just say ID, user with email dot ID. All right, we've already made sure that the user with email exists up here in this if statement. Cool, so that should work. But what we're going to need to do now is we're going to need to rewrite our unshare note route as well as some of the other routes to take into account this new structure in our database. So let's open up our unshare note route. And what we're going to have to do here is we're going to say pull, but instead of saying shared with email, we're going to have to say shared with and put curly braces around this, which will basically tell MongoDB we want to remove the object from shared with whose email property equals the email that we're trying to remove here. All right. So it's basically just a subtle change in the MongoDB query that we're making that will make that happen. All right, so that's all the changes we need to make to our unshare note route. The last one I believe that we're going to need to do is going to be the list notes route, because this is where we actually decide what notes to send back to the user, which ones have been shared with them, etc. So what we're going to need to do here, we're already getting shared with user notes right up here in this query. We're going to need to first of all change this query a little bit. We're going to say instead of notesdb.find shared with blah blah blah, we're going to need to say shared with, And then in curly braces, we're going to need to add an extra set of curly braces around this authUser.email thing. We're going to have to change the query a bit and say $LM right? That's element match. And inside here, we're going to need to say email authUser email. So basically what this is doing, and we do have to add an extra set of curly braces there. You might want to indent this just to make it a little more readable. In fact, I'll do that right here, just so you can see kind of what's going on. Basically, the situation where we need to use this element match operator is when we have an array of elements as a property in one of our objects in MongoDB, right? Such as when we have an object like the one we're having here, which has a shared with property. And this itself is an array of objects, some of which have an email property, etc. When we have a nested structure like this, we need a way to tell MongoDB we want all of the notes in this database whose shared with property contains an object that matches this query right here. So that's basically what that query is saying. All right, and that should be good to send back the right notes to the user, assuming I got everything right. We might need to make one or two adjustments, but let's just give this a try first, I suppose. And one more thing that we're going to want to do here is once we have the shared with user notes, in order to make it easier for ourselves on the front end to know what buttons to show, okay? In other words, if the user can only view it, we want to hide the buttons. If the user can edit but not share, we only want to show the edit button, etc. We're going to want to add some sort of property to each of these shared with user notes that will allow our user to know, or allow our front end to know what permission the user has over that note. So the way that we're going to do this, we're just going to say const shared with notes, or shared with user notes formatted, I guess we'll call it. And for that, we're going to say equals shared with user notes dot map. And for each note here, what we're going to do is add a property directly to that note that will allow the user to know what permission they have over it. So what this is going to look like is something like this. We're just going to say dot 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 note. Okay, so we're getting all of the original properties from the note. And then after that, we're going to add a permission level, I guess we'll call it. We'll say permission level, and this is going to be edit or view or whatever based on what that user's permission is inside this note. Now, the way that we're going to do this is going to be a little bit tricky. We're going to say note.sharedWith.find, and we want to find that shared with setting with the user's email. So we're going to say setting. We want the setting where the setting.email property is equal to the user's email. So we'll say user.email. And once we've gotten that, we want to get the role property. So we're going to say .role at the end of that. And hopefully that should work. If not, we'll have to come back and adjust it a little bit. So let's change this now from shared with user notes to shared with user notes formatted. Right? The formatted just has these extra properties added to it. And let's give this thing a try. So first of all, let's make sure that we don't have any syntax errors. Nope, it looks like we're doing all right there. And let's just go back to our front end and make sure everything is still working so far. We're going to just refresh this. Looks like that works. Let's try a user. Let's actually try sharing notes with a user. So we'll go back to john@gmail.com. Oops, let's try that here. There we go. Log in. And let's click on this and click share. And we'll try sharing it with jane@gmail.com. And if we click share now, okay, so we're getting an error now because we didn't adapt our front end to the new structure of our data. So let's go back into our front end here, and we're going to open up the share settings page. Okay, so note sharing settings page, that is. And what we're going to need to do inside of here is instead of just blindly getting the note.sharedWith property and trying to display that as the emails, we're going to need to say note.sharedWith.map and map each setting here to setting.email. Okay, so that should make it so that it works. Yep, sure enough, we see jane@gmail.com there. Let's just share another note as well. Oops, we're going to go back. Let's do this one here. Okay, so this now says cannot read properties of undefined reading map. That's just because I put map on the wrong place. We're going to need to actually take this from here. And what we're going to do is wrap this in parentheses and put the .map on the end. Okay, so let's go back here now, and we see that that's working like we want it to. So let's try sharing this with jane@gmail.com and click share. And sure enough, it looks like it works. So let's log out now and log in as Jane to see the shared notes. So we'll say ABC123, log in. And sure enough, we see the shared with me notes. So let's click on one of these and see what happens. It looks like everything is still working just the way we wanted it to. All right, and that's all there is to it. We've now restructured our database in such a way that will allow us to add different permissions to our users. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.